Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I am so incredibly excited you're joining me today because, well, we are about to completely shift our perspective. In the past, we've mostly looked inside the individual mind to understand crime, right? Kind of searching for that proverbial bad apple. But today, we are zooming way out. We're shifting our focus from the individual bad apple to the actual barrel they're placed in. We're diving into sociological theories of crime. We'll be looking at how social structures, neighborhoods, relationships, and even society's reaction to rule breaking powerfully shape offending. So get ready to see the world around you in a totally different way.
Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The social roots of crime, 2. Neighborhoods and social disorganization, 3. Strain and social learning, 4. Social bonds and control, 5. Labeling and societal reaction, and finally 6. Power, gender, and lifespan. All right, let's get right into it.
Section 1. The social roots of crime, focusing on Durkheim and structure. We're actually starting our journey right at the turn of the 20th century with French sociologist Émile Durkheim. This guy completely revolutionized how we view rule-breaking. Just listen to this quote. "Crime is normal, not desirable, but inevitable." When you first hear that, it sounds kind of shocking, doesn't it? But Durkheim argued that even if you had a society made up of literal saints, they would still find faults to condemn. And why is that? Because the very act of marking boundaries between right and wrong requires that someone, occasionally, crosses them. Crime, in his view, actually performs a function. It clarifies our moral boundaries. It strengthens community solidarity when we all unite against it. And sometimes, it even signals that social change is desperately needed. A society with absolutely zero deviance? Well, that would be a society totally incapable of evolving. And that brings us to this really crucial concept of anomie. Durkheim introduced this word to describe a state of normlessness. Just imagine a society going through rapid, massive changes. Maybe it's a huge economic crisis or a sudden political upheaval. The old norms collapsed, but the new ones haven't fully formed yet. Behavior just completely loses its anchor. People are left without clear rules to guide their conduct or to limit their desires. And when that social structure fractures, deviance naturally rises. So Durkheim forces us to ask a totally different question. Instead of asking what kind of person commits a crime, we really have to ask what kind of social arrangements produce more or less crime. He basically established that two people with the exact same personalities will behave totally differently in a stable, integrated community compared to a fractured, anomic one. Crime isn't just an individual act, you guys, it's a social fact. Section 2. Neighborhoods and Social Disorganization, featuring the Chicago School. Back in the early 1900s, researchers at the University of Chicago took Durkheim's focus on the environment and applied it directly to the city itself. They actually started studying Chicago the exact same way an ecologist studies a natural habitat. They mapped out the whole city and found that crime was consistently highest in what they called the zone in transition, basically the ring right outside the central business district. But here was the truly mind-blowing discovery. Crime stayed high in this zone regardless of which ethnic immigrant group lived there at the time. As groups prospered and moved outward to the suburbs, the new arrivals inherited the exact same high crime rates. The researchers identified 3 steps that thrive this social disorganization: poverty, residential instability, meaning high turnovers so neighbors never really have time to form lasting bonds, and ethnic or cultural heterogeneity, which really just means people spoke different languages and had totally different backgrounds, making everyday communication much harder. Because of those 3 factors, these neighborhoods really struggle to organize. They lacked what researchers later dubbed collective efficacy. See, when neighbors trust each other and are genuinely willing to intervene for the common good, like, stopping a group of kids from vandalizing a local building, crime drops. So the absolute crucial point here is that crime is a property of the place, not the inherent character of the people living there. And the policy implication of this is massive. If we want to reduce crime, we can't just try to fix people. We absolutely have to build community trust and stabilize housing. Moving right along to Section 3, Strain and Social Learning. Let's look at everyday pressure and peers. So, you might be wondering, why would people in a relatively wealthy society still turn to crime? Well, Robert Merton answered this by adapting Durkheim's idea of anomie into what he called strain theory. He pointed out that American culture relentlessly preaches the American dream, material success for everyone. But the legitimate means to actually get there, like great schools and high-paying jobs, are distributed very, very unequally. And that gap, that creates strain. Merton outlined 5 ways people adapt to this strain: conformists, innovators, ritualists, retreatists, and rebels. But let's look a little closer at the innovators.
They fully accept the societal goal of success, but because they lack the legitimate means, they turn to illegitimate ones. It is a completely predictable result of preaching universal ambition while simultaneously blocking universal opportunity.
A bit later on, Robert Agnew broadened this whole concept into general strain theory, and he brought it right down to the individual emotional level. Because strain isn't just about money, right? It's the failure to achieve personal goals, maybe losing a loved one or facing abuse and bullying. These strains generate intense negative emotions, especially anger and frustration. And for some people, crime simply becomes a coping mechanism for those heavy feelings. This tells us that if we genuinely want to reduce crime, we need to expand legitimate opportunities, like jobs and education, and give people healthier tools to manage everyday life pressures. Now, right alongside strain is how we learn from our peers. Edwin Sutherland and Ronald Akers developed social learning theory, and their argument is actually fascinating. They suggest crime is learned exactly the same way we learn a language or good manners. We learn it through our intimate personal groups. If you have what they call a differential association with rule breakers, encounter an excess of definitions that are favorable to law violation, and see that behavior reinforced or imitating, you are way more likely to offend. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates why things like mentoring, pro-social peer groups, and youth diversion programs are so incredibly effective. Because if crime is learned, it can absolutely be unlearned. All right, Section 4. Social bonds and control. This really asks the question, why don't people offend? I actually want you to pause for a second and really think about this question. Why don't you offend? Because let's be totally honest here. Crime is naturally tempting. It can be super easy, highly profitable, and even exciting. Since that's the case, the real puzzle isn't really why some people break the rules, but what on earth restrains the rest of us from doing it all the time. Travis Hershey provided the classic answer to this with social bond theory. He said we conform because we are strongly bonded to society through 4 key elements. First, attachment. We have parents, friends, and teachers we love and really don't want to disappoint. Second, commitment. We've invested heavily in our education, our careers, our reputations. We simply have too much to lose. Third, involvement. We are so incredibly busy with conventional everyday activities that we literally lack the time to get into trouble. And finally, belief. We fundamentally accept the moral validity of the law. When these 4 bonds are strong, they restrain offending. Now, years later, Hershey actually worked with Michael Gottfredson and proposed a much more controversial counterpart, self-control theory. While social bond theory focuses on external societal connections restraining us, self-control theory focuses on internal regulation. They argued that low self-control, things like impulsivity, short time horizons, and risk-seeking behavior, is actually largely formed by ineffective parenting in early childhood. So, in their view, crime happens when someone with low internal self-control meets an easy external opportunity. On to Section 5, labeling and societal reaction. What happens after the reaction? This brings us to an incredibly unsettling question. What happens after society reacts to a crime? Well, labeling theory suggests that arresting, convicting, and publicly labeling someone can actually deepen and prolong their offending. It's a crazy thought, but the reaction itself basically becomes part of the cause. Labeling theorists distinguish between 2 stages here. Primary deviance is the initial rule breaking. Let's face it, almost everyone does this at some point, maybe a minor theft, some underage drinking, and it usually has very little effect on your identity. But secondary deviance, that is dangerous. That occurs when a person gets caught, is publicly labeled, internalizes that label, and then reorganizes their entire self-concept around it. That label essentially becomes what's known as their master status. It becomes the primary lens through which the rest of the world sees them. Suddenly, they aren't a student who just made a mistake. Society just sees a criminal. And once that label sticks, they get excluded from conventional jobs and housing, which, you guessed it, pushes them right back into deviant networks. This brilliantly illustrates why modern policies like ban the box, record sealing, and restorative justice are so deeply, deeply crucial. We have to prevent a temporary primary mistake from turning into a permanent, lifelong identity. And finally, Section 6, Power, Gender, and Lifespan, looking at critical, feminist, and integrated theories. Now we're going to zoom all the way out to the highest possible level to look at how the rules are written in the first place and who exactly enforces them. Critical and feminist theories serve as really important analytical lenses that basically ask us to look at the structure of the justice system itself. These frameworks suggest that the definition of crime and the focus of enforcement tend to reflect broader structural power and economic inequality. For example, conflict theorists observe that enforcement often falls the hardest on marginalized communities, while the harms caused by the powerful, like massive environmental damage or huge financial exploitation, might actually be undercriminalized. Similarly, feminist criminology examines the gender gap, looking at why men commit more crime than women, and highlights that women's pathways into crime are frequently tied to unique vulnerabilities like prior victimization or abuse. So these theories don't just ask why individuals break laws, they ask why the laws and the system itself look the way they do. Finally, we have integrated theories like Life Course Criminology by Terry Moffat. Because hey, no single theory explains everything, right? This approach looks at the entire lifespan. Moffat notes that most people are what she calls adolescence-limited offenders. They might break some rules as teens, but they eventually age out of crime when they hit major turning points. Things like getting a stable job, a supportive marriage, or joining the military. It's only a very, very small group, the life course persistent offenders, who have chronic problems spanning their entire lifetime. The big takeaway here is that change is possible at many ages, and creating positive turning points is absolutely vital. Wow, we have covered some incredible ground today, from neighborhoods in Anami to peer learning, social bonds, labels, and power structures. Just remember, no single theory captures the whole picture. The key is knowing which lens a given problem really calls for. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Look around your own neighborhood, your own city. Which of these sociological lenses best explains the crime in your own community? Keep analyzing the barrel, not just the apples. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I truly hope this new perspective empowers you to understand our social world just a little bit better. See you next time.